So after you've done the cultural differences argument, then go on to the next argument. This is the tolerance argument for moral relativism. In the last argument, the idea was to infer or imply the truth of moral relativism on the basis of cultural relativism, or cultural diversity with regard to morality. This argument gives a different reason for accepting moral relativism. So here we have another conversational version of this argument. People who are convinced of the truth of their own moral beliefs have committed horrible atrocities in the name of their morality, which they accept as universally true and unassailable, uncriticizable. Take the Nazis, for example. The Nazis were convinced of their own moral and racial superiority on the basis of what they thought counted as objective and scientific truths. On that basis, they engaged in genocide against non-Aryans. We see the same kind of moral intolerance amongst various religious groups towards those who do not share their moral and religious beliefs. According to this line of reasoning, if there are universal moral truths, then we ought to practice intolerance towards those that have a morality different from our own. But obviously, we should not do that. We ought to practice tolerance towards those who have moralities different from our own. So there are no universal moral truths, and if there are no universal moral truths, then the moral truth or morality is relative to current cultural consensus. So there again, we have a conversational version of the argument. You can extract from this argument the key premises to formulate a deductively valid argument, or again, you can look in the textbook on the tolerance argument section and reconstruct the argument from there. So again, get some practice reconstructing those arguments for your short answer assignments. And note in both cases, both regard to the cultural differences argument and in this argument, you're going to need a two-stage argument to construct the complete argument as given. All right, so just pause the video here and give yourself a chance to work on that activity for a little bit. And then after you finish that, come back and let's look at some criticisms of these arguments. All right. So here we have some objections to moral relativism. Obviously, we could have particular objections to individual arguments or some general criticisms of the basic idea. So with regard to the argument from cultural differences, we got some potential arguments. One is that since that argument asserts the fact of moral diversity, that there's widespread disagreement between cultures about morality, we might worry about whether that's empirically correct or not. It certainly looks that way on the surface, but there are some studies that show that that's kind of a surface difference and not a really substantive difference. So if we were able to challenge the empirical claim there, we might have a problem with the argument. Likewise, if your textbook mentions a problem with the what it calls the logic of disagreement that is underlying the disagreement or cultural differences argument. So we might have two objections there. If moral disagreement between cultures is exaggerated, then we'd have an issue. And again, we might have a coherence problem with the argument on logical grounds. If there's a counterexample to disagreement implying non-objectivity. We might also note that if moral relativism is true, and this is a move we see a lot in philosophy, assume a position is true and then try to show that it implies some highly counterintuitive conclusions or something like that, or otherwise unacceptable inferences that are implied by the truth of the original position. And that's the case with regard to the moral equivalence and the arbitrariness objections. So it looks like if moral relativism is true, then no culture is better off morally than any other. So Nazi culture is morally equivalent to non-Nazi culture, then they're both equally valid moral positions. And likewise, if moral relativism is true, it looks like what counts as moral or immoral is just an arbitrary random matter of what culture you happen to be socialized in. So both of those, moral equivalence and moral arbitrariness, seem to undermine the idea that's kind of commonplace in a lot of our moral discourse, that they are non-arbitrary but principled truths, right? Then additionally, we might worry about the difficulty of defining culture. Moral relativism seems to treat culture as a well-defined, isolated, and monolithic thing. But of course, that's not really the truth, especially for people as interconnected as people are in the 21st centuries. There are very few isolated cultures. And then again, just the concept of defining culture at large becomes an issue there as well. And then with regard to moral progress, we might note that the idea of moral relativism is inconsistent with the idea of moral progress, that there's some kind of moral development towards a better way of thinking about morality than a worse way of thinking about morality. So for example, if you think that contemporary American society is morally better off now than when we had in our past institutional forms of slavery, if you think that shows moral progress, that idea is inconsistent with the truth of moral relativism, because if moral relativism is true, then our culture now is not, there's no standpoint by which we could impartially evaluate and say that our culture, our non-slave culture, is better off than our non-institutional, than our culture when we had, or culture when we had institutional forms of slavery. So all those would be objections to moral relativism. So if you have any questions about this topic, be sure and post them in the discussion forum or shoot me an email, and I can address them there. Otherwise, I think you're in pretty good shape to work your way through the readings. Again, be sure you formulate the arguments for your short answer assignments. And again, I'm happy to look at your study sheets to help you formulate those arguments correctly. So if you get those sent in to me in enough time, I can get you some feedback on them before you have to submit the assignment for a grade. All right, folks, that's enough on moral relativism. Hope y'all are doing well, and we'll see you in the next video.